Hi, my name is Sarah Morand. My pen name is SG Morand, and I have embarked on a journey to read through the entire 51-volume set of the Harvard Classics collection. Right now, I'm on volume 2 of the collection, and if you want to check out my last video, I covered The Apology by Plato, The Apology of Socrates, written by Plato. And that was a fun video, and now I'm going to be covering Crito and Phaedo by Plato, which are also dialogues between Socrates and Crito, and Socrates and a group of others that was passed on by Phaedo. I have the volume 2 right here, and today we're going to be talking about Crito and Phaedo. So all of the teachings of Socrates recorded in volume 2 of the Harvard Classics were written by Plato, who was a pupil of Socrates. If you want more information about Socrates and Plato, check out my last video about the Apology, where I go more in depth about who they are. And in this video, I'm combining the Crito and Phaedo because Phaedo is a fairly short account, and I just felt that the two last dialogues that are in volume 2 should just be explored in one video for the sake of being concise and showing how the dialogues were presented in the volume. Crito is a dialogue between Crito and Socrates as Socrates is in prison awaiting his execution. And Crito visits Socrates as a friend and pretty much says, "Hey, I know that you're in this situation, but me and some other supporters of you really want to help you escape and not die as punishment for your teachings." And Socrates gets into this discussion with Crito about why he's going to stay and die for what he is being convicted of and not try to escape. And I feel like Crito is a very good exploration of how the Socratic method works, where Socrates is having a discussion with Crito and he's taking Crito's statements and saying, okay, this is what you said. This is the logical conclusion of where this argument goes if you follow it to its logical end. And Socrates does this largely by asking questions, and he says stuff along the lines of, do you believe this thing? And Crito will say, yes, absolutely, certainly. And then Socrates will say, well, if you believe that, then do you also believe this? And Crito says, yes. And then they go to the next thing, and Socrates says, so if you believe this and this and this, then the logical conclusion is this. Do you agree with this? And Crito says, no, that's not what I meant. And Socrates is like, well, if you take the arguments that you did make, then this is where you end up. And by arguing in that manner, Socrates is, in a way, turning Crito to his point of view and making him see what he believes. And I think that's just a very interesting form of dialogue, and it's something that I found very interesting in the teachings of Socrates, and something that I feel like was very clearly what was going on in Crito. I feel like Crito is the best example of the 3 dialogues that are found in volume 2 of the Harvard Classics of what the Socratic method does and how to get answers by asking questions, that type of thing. So, that being said, let's talk a little bit about the quotes that really stuck out to me in Crito. And again, I'll be talking about Crito and Phaedo. I'm going to start out with Crito and treat it as a separate dialogue, which it is, and then I will go on to discuss Phaedo. Socrates, most of these quotes are said, I think all of the quotes that I wrote down were said by Socrates. But in the context of the dialogue, there was discussion from both Socrates and Crito. Socrates says, Dear Crito, your zeal is invaluable, if a right one. But if wrong, the greater the zeal, the greater the evil. And therefore we ought to consider whether these things shall be done or not. So when Crito goes and says, Socrates, you should escape. And Socrates is saying, you're a very zealous friend. Your zeal is admirable, but it's only admirable if your zeal is for the right thing. If it's for something evil, then it's all the more evil because of how zealous you are to perform it. And so he's warning him, okay, before I agree to your plan, I want to have a discussion with you and talk through everything. And this is kind of the opening of the dialogue between the two men. Socrates then, in one of his discussions, says, Then, my friend, we must not regard what the many say of us, but what the one man who has understanding of just and unjust will say, and what the truth will say. Crito was very concerned about the opinions of other people, and that's shown throughout this dialogue. Crito frequently tells Socrates, if you stay in prison, people will think you're guilty. And Socrates says, well, he pretty much says, well, I am guilty of what they're accusing me of, which is that I taught these things, and that's why I'm in prison. And Socrates was much less worried about the opinions of others, and he pretty much had the opinion that if someone didn't believe him and thought him a criminal, then that person's opinion was not worth his time to consider. And I think that's something that was very interesting and very important. I think it's important to remember that you're going to offend somebody no matter what you do at times, and to focus on the opinions of people who are actually wise and who you respect and look up to. And that's not to say that you should not take negative opinions from others on occasion to help correct yourself, and if somebody calls you out for doing something, that you should listen to them. If you believe that they are correct, if you realize that they are correct in calling you out for that thing, and realize that you were in the wrong. But in this way, Socrates is saying, those are the types of opinions that I care about, and the ones of the people who threw me in this prison, I don't care about. And if people look at me sitting in this prison and believe me to be a criminal, then I don't really care what they think, because those who follow the truth will know the truth, and they will know that I am innocent of the crimes, the cruel things that the government is saying that I have done. Socrates also says, or are we to rest assured, in spite of the opinion of the many, and in spite of consequences, whether better or worse, of the truth of what was then said, that injustice is always an evil, and dishonor to him who acts unjustly? Crito would make the argument that what they were doing was just because Socrates was innocent, and that by breaking him out of prison they weren't doing something evil because the government itself was being evil and throwing him into prison. And Socrates argued that it's always wrong to do the wrong thing, even if your reasoning for why you do that thing is good. If you do the wrong thing, you're still in the wrong. And he made that argument to Crito and said that no matter what the consequences you found yourself in are, no matter the injustice done to you, you still must do what is right. Along that same line, Socrates said, then we ought not to retaliate or render evil for evil to anyone, whatever evil we may have suffered from him. And that is kind of the end of the quotes from Crito. Again, Crito and Phaedo are both shorter dialogues, so that's why I combined them together. The Crito I found very interesting. I definitely enjoyed the apology the most out of the three dialogues, but Crito I found interesting because Socrates was very one of the main themes was that even if injustice is done to you, you must do the right thing, and the wrong thing is always wrong. And I think that's important to remember, because there is absolute truth, and no matter what others do to you, you should hold yourself higher than that, and you should be willing to do what is right even if it hurts you in the end. And that's a very important teaching of Socrates, I think, that anybody can learn from. So, moving on to Phaedo. Phaedo is a dialogue between Socrates, Apollodorus, Simmias, Cebes, and Crito that Phaedo, who was also present during this dialogue, describes to Echecrates. And Echecrates pretty much says, Phaedo, you were there during Socrates' last hours, tell me what happened. And so Phaedo is giving this second-hand account, but through this second-hand account, we see the dialogues between Socrates and these other men who were present at his death. The dialogue takes place in Socrates' prison cell, and it is just before he takes poison to end his life. The way that his execution was conducted is that the prison guards gave him poison, and he drank the poison, and that's how he died. So they all knew that he was about to die, and this dialogue takes place right before and during. Well, right before his death, and then it describes his death, and then that's the end. Something that's interesting about this dialogue is that Socrates, in his final hours, decided to talk about philosophy. He talked about philosophical teachings and truths, and kind of was passing on his teachings to these people who were present, and even having discussions with them about certain issues, like he always did when he was teaching in the city. Some quotes that I really enjoyed from Phaedo were, "How singular is the thing called pleasure, and how curiously related to pain, which might be thought to be the opposite of it. For they never come to a man together, and yet he who pursues either of them is generally compelled to take the other. There usually is not pleasure without pain in some regard. If you love something, if you love someone, and that person dies, then you're going to experience pain, but you experience pleasure in loving them in the first place." And Socrates is saying this in relation to his life. It's not uncommon for us to face pain as we are facing, as a consequence of having faced pleasure to begin with. And he's telling this to his companions who are about to watch him die and be there with him in his last hours, and is kind of comforting them in a way with this teaching. Socrates also says, "And what is purification but the separation of the soul from the body? As I was saying before, the habit of the soul gathering and collecting herself into herself out of all the courses of the body, the dwelling in her own place alone, as in another life, so also in this, as far as she can, the release of the soul from the chains of the body." Socrates talks about death in a way that it's more of a release from the burdens of the body, and it's a way of the soul being free. And as a Christian, that's something that I believe as well. Although Socrates believed it differently, it was funny, as I was reading this, I would be reading it and be like, yeah, I agree. And then he throws reincarnation in there out of nowhere, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's right. He's not a Christian teacher. But that's kind of how he believed about the soul, was he talked a little bit about how he believes in reincarnation of the soul in another form. And so when you look at it in that context, this quote maybe is not as optimistic as it would be if it was just the soul being released for eternity. But it's still really interesting to me that he believed that he didn't fear death. All throughout his life, he was not afraid to do what was right, even in the face of death. And he did not fear death so much as losing himself and not being his full self and not teaching others what he believed. And I think that's something to really look up to and aspire to be like. Socrates also said that anything which becomes greater must become become greater after being less. So you're always going to start, if you want to be greater, you're always going to have to start out at a less place. And that's okay to start out in that less place. And I think, if I remember correctly, he said this quote in relation to the soul. As in, the soul will be greater after it loses the body, and while it's in the body, it is less. That type of description. And I think that's very interesting. Just a quote that really stuck out to me throughout the book. Socrates also said, "And when you see a man who is repining at the reproach of death, is not his reluctance a sufficient proof that he is not a lover of wisdom, but a lover of the body, and probably at the same time a lover of either money or power or both?" Socrates was saying that those who fear death are very attached to life. They are attached to their bodies, they're attached to wealth, they're attached to power, or all of the above. And true wisdom is to not be attached to those things. And if you're not attached to those things, if you have true wisdom, you will not fear death, as some men do. Socrates also said, "And is not this discreditable? The reason is that a man having to deal with other men has no knowledge of them. For if he had knowledge, he would have known the true state of the case, that few are the good and few the evil, and that the great majority are in the interval between them." This is something that I'm not quite sure if I agree with fully or not, but I did find it very interesting that Socrates says there are some men who are good, some that are evil, but the majority of men are a little bit of both. And extremes are very uncommon, which I would agree with that. There are not very many people who are like serial killers, and there's not very many people who are like willing to die for others. And there's a lot of people in the middle who are like trying to do their best, but they have their vices. They're not perfect. Nobody's perfect, but they're not trying to be a hero, and they're not trying to be a villain either. And that is the true state of humanity. And I think this is a interesting view and a little bit of a pessimistic one in some ways, because I would believe that yes, this is probably the case, but the goal would be to change, to be able to slowly work towards being a better version of yourself. And I just found that this quote stuck out to me and it made me think. And I think that is something that is very important about Socrates' teachings, is as you're reading any philosophy really, but Socrates I found in particular, although it is the only one I've read so far of the philosophy type field. But I did find as I was reading it that there were times where I stopped as I was reading a section, and I stopped and considered and thought, what do I believe in this regard? I feel like Socrates makes good points in this area, and I don't agree with him in this area, and I feel like there's got to be some middle ground that I would fit into. And it made me kind of zero in a little more on what I believe about certain things, which I think is something that is good for everybody to do, is to really examine yourself and your own beliefs and to know why you believe what you do and be able to defend that belief. Which brings me to the next quote. "Whereas he, the partisan, seeks to convince his hearers that what he says is true, I am rather seeking to convince myself. To convince my hearers is a secondly matter to me." So Socrates was saying some people try to convince others of what they are arguing, and while some do that, Socrates, his goal is to convince himself. So as he's making an argument, he's examining why he believes that thing and figuring out what exactly his argument should be in order to support that thing. And he's hearing other people's opinions and things and following their discussions to the natural conclusion of the argument. And And by so doing, he is breaking apart everybody's arguments and picking through it and seeing why they argue for what they argue for and what their reasoning leads to. And I think in a way, by doing that, he's also building upon his own argument and his own view of things. The last quote I have is right before Socrates dies, and he says that this is death, which is the destruction not of the body but of the soul. For in the body, the work of destruction is ever going on. It's important to remember that our bodies are temporary, and that's how they're designed. And we're so afraid of destruction of the body and death, but it's kind of an ongoing process all throughout. I think it's like when you reach 25 or something, after that point, your body starts to deteriorate. And I'm not yet 25, but I already feel the effects of this to some extent. And it's something that's important to remember, is that this body is not made to last forever, and death comes for everyone. And it's not something that we should be afraid of. It's something that is a natural conclusion, and we should make use of our lives in the best way we can in the meantime. So, on that somewhat depressing note, maybe, for some people, maybe a little bit for everyone. I personally don't like to think about death that much, but this book definitely made me consider some things that I think was important for me to think through. So, Crito and Phaedo, the last two collections of Socrates' dialogues that are present in Volume 2 of the Harvard Classics, I really enjoyed them. I thought all three dialogues, the Apology, Crito, and Phaedo, were very important in their own special way. I believe Socrates had other teachings, dialogues and stuff, that were also written by Plato. I'm not exactly sure about that, but I think there are others that aren't included in the Harvard Classics. But I definitely think that these three were a good starting place. And the next collection I have in here is the Golden Sayings of Epictetus. So, I feel like I've heard the name Epictetus before, but I don't know where. I don't think I've really heard any of his teachings, so I'm interested to see what that is about, and I'll be going into it fairly blind, which can be fun and exciting. In the meantime, Crito, Phaedo, I would say they were great reads, very important, and definitely fitting for Volume 2 of the Harvard Classics. I really like how Volume 1 was kind of about the importance of education and classical education, the importance of a good work ethic, and Volume 2 is kind of starting at the foundations of a classical education, which is philosophy and very old philosophical teachings. And I'm looking forward to reading the Golden Sayings of Epictetus. If you have read any of Socrates' dialogues, leave a comment down below which one is your favorite. And if you have any philosophy recommendations, let me know. If you like this video, subscribe for more videos like this, and leave a comment down below. Next video is the Golden Sayings of Epictetus. See you then.